Hey, it's your boy Drew, and today I want to talk a little bit about critical thinking or the lack thereof. A few days ago, I was with some coworkers and we were discussing the subway shooting in Brooklyn that happened recently, and that conversation descended into the murder rates in Chicago being bad. And then it descended into a place where I don't necessarily like to go or talk about, but I knew that it was going to possibly happen, so we went there. And I'm not the kind of person that's afraid of difficult topics. Black on black crime. Of which my response was, according to the FBI crime statistics in 2019, white people commit 70% of the crime in the United States. That silenced everyone. One person had said, then why are there so many black people in prison? Why the disparity? Which I explained. They're disproportionately arrested, and then they're often too poor to get out of jail. And for one crime, you often have several black men that are arrested for that specific crime. But then, something that's also not talked about is 60% of those men are exonerated. That doesn't factor into the analysis as well. Then I asked the question, why is it that crime, in your opinion, is lower in the suburbs? And I responded, because no one had an answer, by saying, because people in the suburbs have decent jobs, there's no need for them to commit crime. So that stares in the face of the fact that black people disproportionately commit violent crime, or crime, because that's the tacit substitute word for violent crime, because other crime doesn't really count, apparently. But with the data bit that I shared, that makes that statistic very flawed, So after some really dulling silence, the response was, well, why is it that that narrative isn't often discussed? Then I replied, why do you think that is? What the media might have you believe is that black men are the criminals in the United States, but really, according to the FBI, that's not true. The boogeyman is someone else. So then I ask, why do you think that you don't know this information since it's so readily available? You could literally Google this information on FBI. Like, everyone knows that FBI is where you get crime statistics, but no one Googles it. So you can Google this information, it's right there. Then we talked about, what did we talk about? Then we talked about, they said affirmative action is bad for poor people. My rebuttal was, well, everybody knows who Oprah is. She provides an interesting angle to this affirmative action is bad for everyone conversation, because she's like the pinnacle of what I would consider the decadent black veil conversation we'll have about what that means later, and how if it wasn't for affirmative action, there would be no Oprah. Her getting a job at that media company because of affirmative action, them or that media company viewing Oprah as the perfect token. She's black, she's female. Then I got into a conversation about my father and how if it wasn't for affirmative action, he wouldn't have gotten the job at the hospital that he did here in the United States, which paved the way for my family to thrive. My family's from Jamaica. I've talked about this a few times in a couple of other videos. And he came to the United States in the mid-1960s, kind of on an outlier story situation. My father got some tickets from a friend of his that allowed him to travel to the United States in the mid-1960s, where he was to farm some sugarcane some sugarcane farms in Florida near Lake Okeechobee. And I don't know if you guys know about how brutal the work is on a sugarcane farm. Back in slavery times, in the Caribbean specifically, in Jamaica and in Barbados, where a lot of sugar was grown, the work on those plantations were so brutal that many of the slaves just kept dying from the work, dismembering themselves, like breaking their backs and arms and all sorts of crazy stuff to do that work. So they had to constantly have a supply of slaves that were coming into Jamaica and Barbados. So I'm saying that to say, keep that in mind, as that was the work my father was to do when he immigrated to the United States, or came to the United States for work. A few days into that, my dad quit. Obviously that wasn't for him. And through information that either my dad doesn't remember or he won't share with me, he was able to make it to New York, and over in New York he had some relatives. Subsequently, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and then that enshrined the affirmative action policy that required employees to have a certain amount of black women and men working in their establishments. You know, it was at a podium standing high at Howard University in 1965 where LBJ said, "You don't have to wipe away the scars of centuries by saying now you are free to go where you want, do as you desire, and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a man for years that has been hobbled by chains. Liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, saying you are free to compete with all of the others and still justly believe you have been completely fair." This is the next and more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom but opportunity, not just legal equity but human equity, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and as a result. He said that at Howard University. Because of this, my dad got a job as an electrician at a hospital. Affirmative action policies allowed my dad to get a loan to buy a home from a bank. Affirmative action policies is what allowed my dad to bring my mother here from Jamaica, and that property that my father purchased sponsored my dad and my mom to get green cards, becoming residents of the United States. My mom was able to go to Medgar Evers College and become a nurse, catapulting my parents into the middle class. So affirmative action definitely doesn't destroy poor people, it actually empowers them. Then another weird example they would give was people living in rural areas are happier than those in the city. But then I was like, so how do you explain, like, for example, I have a lot of friends that are Latino, and I grew up in the city, and all of my Latin friends' families seem to be very happy. So that kind of, I was like, how do you explain that? You know, since we're using anecdotal evidence anyway. I was like, you need to be able to kind of quantify what you're talking about when you're having these conversations. Because they couldn't account for families that they claimed were happy in rural areas, but then I had evidence that supported families that were happy in the city. I think that thought process is so underdeveloped, it immediately fell apart. They kept saying, like, well, there are rules in the city that make things difficult for people. I said, well, what rules are you talking about? They didn't have a response to that. They couldn't name any. I then brought up generational trauma in the black community that's pervasive. And then they said, well, the government stands in the way of the progress of the poor. And I said, well, I really disagree with that. I feel like the government, for the most part, works. It works pretty well. I brought up the New Deal after World War II that was instrumental in creating an American middle class that has lasted for generations. That New Deal did leave out black people. But aside from that, we have clean air. We have clean water. We come into a building or we use bridges that don't just fall apart underneath us because of the government regulations. When our government isn't a kakistocracy, which is like the worst of the worst running the government, it works. So why don't they know this? And is it wise to just go around thinking things? Is it wise to go around not thinking things through and not doing your own research, let alone any research? I have a relentless desire to ask people to kind of quantify the data that they're talking about, because when we have anecdotal debates ad nauseum, well, we can have anecdotal debates ad nauseum, but when you quantify, or rather quantification undergirds facts or thoughts, and it makes points final and tangible. For example, I could say, I feel like it's safer to drive than to fly, right? I could say that. We can argue about that point. But statistically, and according to the National Transportation Safety Board that compiles this kind of data, quote, in absolute numbers, what was the quote? In absolute numbers, driving is more dangerous with more than 5 million accidents compared to 20 accidents in flying. A more direct comparison could be per 100 million miles, Pitt's driving's 1.27 fatalities and 80 injuries against 0 in flying. Deaths and no injuries, essentially. Which again shows that air travel would be safer. So, to say that I feel that it's safer to drive than fly would be inaccurate, you know? I'm sorry if my friend is watching this video, but I'm putting this conversation on blast because I think it's a great example of what I'm talking about here. He said that he's moving to Dallas, Texas, because he's tired of the cold weather here. Right now I live in Southeast Virginia. And I said, well, the cold weather here is the same cold weather that's there. And he said, no, it's not. Dallas is further south. I said, Virginia Beach, to my understanding, is in, and I'm like a big nerd about like weather and climate and stuff. I was like, Virginia Beach is in USDA Hardiness Zone 8A. Dallas is in USDA Hardiness Zone 8A, I believe. What am I missing? He doesn't like the weather here to move somewhere else that has the same weather. Another funny story, I was walking down 14th Street in New York, in Manhattan, years ago. This is a long time ago. This is like a good 10, 15 years ago. And I think I had my headphones in, but I was at the intersection of 14th Street and I want to say 7th Avenue. Yes, in front of like a tanning salon. And I guess there was a guy that worked for the tanning salon. And he stopped me and he's like, hey. And so I took out my earbuds and I was like, yes. And he said, free tanning? And I said, do I look like I tan? Oh, I just give this to everyone. Okay. These examples that I bring up show the undeveloped thoughts or ideas of which people live in their truth, and they're flawed, and they're dangerously wrong. Not knowing FBI crime statistics, thinking the affirmative action always hurts the poor. Moving further south in the United States means warmer weather without considering other aspects of United States geography and climate. Thinking a dark-skinned black man tans. I think we need to exercise more critical thinking. You never know. It could save a life. It's your boy Drew. And always remember to smile even when you're not smiling. And think critically.